As digital experience becomes more dynamic and interconnected, apps and APIs have become the new frontline in security. And with the rise of generative AI, threat actors are adapting just as fast, probing APIs, targeting business logic, and scaling attack faster than ever before. Akamai's latest State of Apps and API Security 2025 report digs deep into these shifts and how organizations can stay ahead. Joining me today is once again Steve Winterfeld, Advisory CISO at Akamai, to unpack the key findings from API abuse trends to AI's growing influence on both offense and defense, and to share what security team can do next. Let's start with the big picture. What were some of the key findings from this year's State of Apps and API Security report? And before we actually go into these findings, just remind our viewers, what is this report all about?
So we turn out a number of research reports here at Akamai. They're called State of the Internet reports. They focus on different topics. The next one we have coming out will be on fraud and abuse. This one is on, the state of apps and APIs. And what we like to do is, any given day, 20 to 30% of the internet traffic goes across Akamai platform. And so we see a lot of traffic. We see a lot of the attacks. And we just want to share what we see on our platform so people can understand what risks are out there and what they should be doing about them.
Now let's talk about some of the key findings.
So this year in our report, we did something a little bit different. Is we had the ability to go in and say which attacks are going against which frameworks. And so we all know OWASP is a great organization that helps us understand what are the top 10 kinds of attacks. There's a top 10 for web attacks, a top 10 for API attacks, and this year there's a top 10 for large language model or generative AI attacks. What we did is we said, what is a change in OWASP API attacks, or what is a percentage? And we saw 32% of the overall attacks are going against known top 10 OWASP attacks. Whereas another great MITRE attack framework, and that is, a series of steps somebody can use to attack you so you can spread your defenses across multiple ways and interdict the threat attack methodology multiple times. We see 30% of the attacks going against the MITRE attack framework key indicators, 22% against ISO 2700, 21% against GDPR, which is Europe privacy law, and then we saw about 16% against PCI DSS, which is the payment card industry, standard for protecting yours. So it's a chance for you to go look and say, can my tool map to this kind of analysis? And if it can, is that something I want to share with our leadership to say, hey, we see, we have credit cards, and we see right now 16% of the attacks are against our credit cards. Might be insight worth sharing. Some other things that were top of mind, we saw a 94% growth in DDoS attacks. We saw 63% year over year against web and API attacks. And we're noticing, because of the huge growth in APIs, we see zombie or shadow or ghost APIs. We see industry leaders are saying they feel almost half of them, 47%, are not mapped to the data, so they don't know if those attacks are going against critical data.
This year's report puts a special focus on APIs, and which has been focused for a long time. Why did you zero in there, and how are APIs playing a much bigger and much critical role in both enabling and exposing AI workloads?
So, again, API is that machine-to-machine kind of interface, and that's the perfect interface if you're working with generative AI or large language models. And so really we have, as a CISO, I have three things I think about. How are my people using generative AI? How am I using it internally? And where do I have it facing externally as a capability customers can use? And so here we're going to talk a little bit about that third aspect where it's public facing and people, then anybody can engage with it. And so a lot of those may be done through APIs. And so what we're seeing is, that um, the generative AI is the primary cause of API incidents reported by commerce. And again, commerce is probably the leading industry here. And so, you know, with any transformation, as we move fast, we don't always get security right at the beginning. And so, again, go to your OWASP top 10 for large language models and API attacks. Don't forget about DDoS attacks if it's customer facing. But we need to start understanding, how are we tracking that generative AI as it becomes more and more critical to our business processes. And so we talk a lot in this and all our reports as, because Akamai is now moving into protecting large language models. So we're getting more insights we can share. We're seeing that more and more the threat is going after this capability.
What kind of major industry-wide trends you observed across sectors like finance, retail, and healthcare when it comes to app and API security?
It's always fascinating to me as we look at the regions and the industries. Industries actually will change by region. So, finance may be number one in North America, and you get over to someplace like EMEA or APJ, and it falls down to 3 or 4. And so, first I would encourage you to go get our latest SOTI report from Akamai if you're interested in the details of the regions, because we don't have time to cover all the nuances of the industries. Again, commerce, probably the number one, moving into microservice architectures. API development has just expanded that attack surface. And so we see them being the most attacked. Typically we see that at the layer 7. You drop down to layer 3, 4, you'll see somebody like finance being the most attacked in those by DDoS. And so it all depends on what you're talking about for industry trends. Overall, we do provide a lot of graphics. So if you want to go see where your industry ranks, we have graphics in the report so you can have a quick view that you can share with the rest of your organization and see how you rank both with regions and within industries.
Did you see any noticeable difference regionally, whether it's attack patterns, risk level, or how organizations are responding? Because we are going through some geopolitical crisis, trade war is going on, two big wars going on as well.
Well, again, I think you nailed it with the two wars are really impacting a lot, but most of those impacts are around DDoS attacks. We see traditional ransomware attacks are not as impacted by hacktivism or nation state sponsored attacks or politically driven attacks. So cybercrime is still cybercrime to most degrees. We have seen a 73% web attacks in Asia year over year, a 37% web attacks in Europe and the Middle East year over year, and a 20% layer 7 DDoS attack in EMEA, as opposed to where you'll see a huge increase in that layer 3, 4 for DDoS. So again, those DDoS are probably layer 7, may not be as politically motivated. And that's where we get into the challenges as, trying to come up with our risk profile. What are the motivations and intent of those people, attacking us?
How do you see the role of AI evolving on the defensive side? Are security teams using it effectively to keep up with these threats?
So we continue to see a couple things with Gen AI on the defensive side. The first is, and I'll talk about what we're doing with our capabilities at Akamai. Our Zero Trust is already putting out natural language queries. So it is extremely hard to find, security analysts right now. And when you do get them and train them up, they often get hired away. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to use that Gen AI to, build a query. So a zero-day threat comes out and it's got a protocol. I'll go back to the popular one we always use for an example, Log4j. You know, back in the day, it would take a senior analyst and somebody from, asset management combing through data to say, where do we have that? Now with some of the security tools, any analyst can use a natural query and say, where do we have Log4j protocol being used across the network? And the generative AI will answer that question. And then you can say, which of those are externally facing? And it'll answer that question. And so, that's the first and probably most powerful place we can use it, is integrating it with our current capabilities to really make it easy for our analysts to do their job. Not necessarily replacing anybody, but just, bringing a lot of those skill sets down so more people can do a more effective job in a faster way. And then that second is, kind of the things you're talking about. Just like we see some of the threats starting to use AI, if you look at Worm GPT or Fraud GPT, a lot of that is around social engineering. We can start to use some of those in the same ways as, automating our pen test, or doing, automating our vulnerability scanning with Gen AI to ask more intuitive questions. So I see both of those expanding within their uses.
There is a growing tension between speed of deployment and security. What guidance do you have for balancing developer velocity with protection at the API layer?
I think we're, first of all, part of this goes back to culture. Where you can build that integrated culture of, part of caring about customers is giving a great and secure experience. That's step one. Then you've got to give everybody the right skill sets. The security team needs to understand what's going on in, let's say, a serverless environment, or with containers, or, they need to understand that environment, and they need to provide the tools that are easy to integrate. And so if you have continuous development, continuous deployment, you need to provide security hooks from the security team that make it easy for the developers just to grab and go. On the developer side, I really need you to understand that, secure, well-written code is going to give a better customer and a secure customer experience. And so if you inform them, these are the top 10 API attacks, and this is how to not write code that has broken authentication in it, then, we're giving them the skills they need to be successful. The same with large language models. Is it private? Are we doing these things for generative AI? So we have to encourage and enable them to be successful on the developer side. And so again, that partnership of making sure everybody, first of all, same mission, same skill sets have been provided, or necessary skill sets have been provided, is probably the foundation to build that on. And then the final thing is, we need to provide that backstop. I need to do, automatic detection. So if somebody doesn't go through the security controls, we can catch them and say, hey, I need you to do these things. You may not have been aware of it. If somebody slips up and makes some insecure code, we have real-time checking for vulnerabilities. So I think it's that, just like with people with avoiding phishing emails, we can train them, but that we have to backstop them with technology.
Now, that was for both developers and DevOps team. Based on the report, what are your top recommendations for security and DevOps teams looking to stay ahead of these evolving threats?
I think the first is, for a general recommendation across the report is, establish an API security plan. Just like I said, how are you checking it in development? How are you checking at runtime? Are you implementing security measures like an adaptive security engine, runtime protection, API testing tools, so that you're detecting, hey, you have a zombie API you used over here in a lab that is still up. I need you to take that down. those kind of oversights is where we need that partnership, so that that's happening. And if somebody brings in, Ghost API, if let's say, a developer or even somebody like HR brings in a new capability, deploys it, it's not within our purview. Security can't protect what it doesn't know about. So how do we detect that, and how do we get it back under the umbrella? And then finally, going back to what I was really excited about earlier, is how do I work with the developers to say, hey, we went out and tested and we see this are a lot of attacks against this OWASP broken auth. We really want you to focus this month on making sure you don't have any of that. Here's the MITRE attack framework. We see, a percentage of ghosts going against the MITRE attack or PCI. I think having those framework discussions where you say, hey, look, this is a threat really attacking. What you're putting out there is under real-time attack. I think that really helps both sides.
Steve, thank you so much for joining me today and share the findings of these reports and for also sharing these recommendations, suggestions for teams. Thank you for insight, and I look forward to the next discussion.